Hello and welcome to the Dental Elite webinar. This is a pre-recorded webinar and all of the information we've given is correct at the time of recording. There is a live feed, however, so if you have got any questions, we are online right now to answer any questions you may have, so please just pose them in the relevant box and we're more than happy to answer them. Over the course of this webinar, we're going to cover 3 or 4 key themes alongside the title of the Great Corporate Practice Grab, Getting the Maximum for Your Practice in a Changing Landscape. In the first instance, we're going to look at what the market's doing right now and what kind of things are impacting the market and what the rationale is behind that and whether that may well be the case for many years to come or whether we see that changing potentially over the course of time. And then Paul's going to look at valuation methodology.
Yeah, I'll look and review valuation methodology, how the changes in the market have impacted that process and what you can do to sort of prepare for that. And then lastly, we'll look at the sort of top practical tips to help you safeguard the value of your practice when you're getting close to that point in time.
So let's begin with probably why most of you may indeed actually be watching this webinar, is to get an idea as to what's going on in the current marketplace, because there's loads written in the dental press about who's selling, who's buying, who's not selling or who's not buying, as perhaps the case may be, and it's certainly safe to say that in the last 18 months to 2 years there's been significant changes in who your average acquirer is in the dental sector. So the first thing that's probably changed, which we've never seen before in dental practices, is that some of the bigger corporates are disposing of a number of practices. And the question is, why is this happening? The corporates have been in existence, certainly in their current buying spree, since I came into the market back in 2006, 2007. Yet at the moment, it does seem that there are a number of practices going on the market, and also, let it be said, at probably very cheap prices comparably to what else you can buy practices for elsewhere in the market. So let's examine perhaps why that is. Okay, so let's look at this group of a fictitious group of 10 practices. So you'll notice that each of these practices has a bubble next to them, and the bubbles represent the EBITDA that particular practice is giving off. Now, EBITDA, for those of you that don't know, is an accounting acronym. It stands for earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. And what that is in dental practice terms is it's the true operating profit of a practice. So let's say you're working in your practice and you're working there full time and you're delivering, so let's say 7,000 UDAs. So that's going to come at a cost to the business of £77,000 per annum if they had to pay someone to do your job and they didn't work there themselves. Equally, there'll be things in there like rent. Maybe you may own your building, but you're not charging yourself for rent. It may well be also there's a number of things that can be added back. So, for instance, the trip to the overseas dental conferences, or maybe a spousal salary, or the gardener, or something along those lines. So we have to understand what the true operating profit is. So the one message before we begin on this is to say it's definitely not the net profit that's on your set of accounts, because if that's the figure you're focusing on and that figure's correct, then you probably need to change your accountant, because what your accountant will be preparing your accounts for is ultimately to determine how much tax you're going to pay next year. So they will be adding all sorts of things into your accounts to reduce that profitability. So part of our job as valuers is to come in and determine what that EBITDA is. Okay, but let's go back to our corporate group. So in this particular group, as you can see, there are 10 different practices and the numbers vary considerably. And this is fairly atypical of a group of 10 practices. So you've got some which are fantastic, real sort of jewels in the crown. So you'll see you've got a couple of practices with £180,000 in EBITDA, £174,000 in EBITDA, and they're the practices the corporates are keeping hold of. They're the ones they really want to focus on. But you'll also notice that there's 2 other practices. There's one in red, and the reason why the number's in brackets is because that's demonstrating a loss. So that particular practice is losing £8,000 per annum. And then you've got the other practice up here in the top right, and that's only generating £15,000 per annum. So the argument in that practice is actually by the time you're building all of the head office effort and cost and real management cost of running that practice, it probably in real terms is making a loss even though it's posting a profit. And it's these 2 practices that within the fictitious group of 10 are likely to be up and put up for sale, because put simply they demand so much effort for absolutely no gain in the true overarching EBITDA of the corporate group. Okay, so but why is that happening, and why did they not have, why did those practices even end up in the group in the first place? Well, the first is that the market has changed, the inclement has changed. Recruitment issues have become tougher and tougher. Now, it's always been the case that it's been harder to recruit in some areas of the UK than others, but ultimately those roles have always gone on to be filled. Whereas now what some of the bigger groups especially are feeling is that those roles just aren't being filled, or they're being filled at a significantly higher price than what they may have been filled for 2 years ago. So So for instance, a role that may have been quite easily budgeted and acquired on the basis of paying a dentist £10 per UDA, actually now they're having to pay 12, 13, or even in maybe some areas of the northeast, up to £15 per UDA. And that's why that practice, that when they bought it was budgeted to deliver £100,000 in EBITDA, is now posting an £8,000 loss, because put simply, they just can't deliver the revenue for the same gross profit margin that they were doing so previously before. Okay, so why is that happening? Why have we got a shortage of dentists in the UK? Well, put simply, we just don't qualify enough. There's not enough UK dental schools, and we're not throwing out enough UK graduates year on year to deliver the amount of dentistry that needs to be delivered. And that may not necessarily be just about the volume of dentists that we're qualifying, but maybe also the dynamic and the spread of who those dentists are. Because if you look at some of the statistics out there, we're qualifying more and more female dentists. The spread of dentists in dental schools in the most recent year was up to about 73-75% female. And without meaning to sound stereotypical in any way, shape or form, generally speaking, they are not in the workforce on a full-time basis in the same way that a male undergraduate is, which creates a workforce pressure and a workforce problem. The other aspect is the other end of the scale, so people are retiring earlier. Again, the reason for that is likely to be hinged on goodwill values. So whereas a dentist who would have worked quite happily in his career until he was 60 to 65 is now selling his practice at 55 to 57. So we're losing 5 to 7 years off the back end of their career there. They're leaving the workforce, so they're dropping down to a day or two a week because they've got the value of their practice. Of course, the changing regulation on pensions doesn't really help that either, because whereas they may have stayed in the NHS service with the view that they could continue to bolster their pension, with the decreases in the lifetime allowance, is actually there's no purpose for them doing that anymore, because they're already at the maximum they can be. So they just stop delivering NHS work, or they leave the system entirely. Of course, there's a number of other hypotheses as well. You've got, dare I say it, Brexit, but I really don't want to talk about that because everyone talks about that and no one really knows what they're talking about. But it is fairly safe to say that since we voted Brexit just over a couple of years ago now, is that there has been a softening of the pound. And what that's meant is it's not quite as attractive to work in the UK as it was for someone who maybe was living in Poland before, because it's not worth the same amount of money as it was before. And that's represented in the fact that EU applications have slowed down to the GDC and are now at its lowest level since 2009, according to NHS England. And of course, then if you do want to come here, you then have to get through the NHS performer registration process, which is currently administered by Capita. And there is significant challenges in that. In fact, we worked with a practice over in Suffolk who recruited a dentist from Portugal who wanted to come and work in the UK. He got himself a flat in preparation to start work, and some 10 months later, an NHS performer number still wasn't through. So he was paying out for this flat in Ipswich with absolutely no money coming in, and ultimately he gave up and decided to go home. So an entire year-long process of waiting performer number was wasted, and that particular practice then had the dented an empty chair for that 12 months as well in preparation for waiting for this person to start. Okay, so what that's meant is that bigger remuneration packages is that we've got a number of dental corporates out there, and indeed individual dental practices who are now offering golden handshakes to join the group, and sometimes they're up to £20,000 to £25,000 in the most difficult areas. So not only are they having to pay more per UDA, they're having to pay signing on fees, and as a result of that, we're also seeing the dental workforce being slightly more transient, because actually whereas they maybe otherwise would have settled into a post and got used to the patient list and built out their private work, there's now significant temptation to take on other opportunities, particularly as the dental corporates now trying to make their package overall a better offering by opening training academies and offering better support in some of the private aspects of dentistry, such as say Invisalign and implants. Okay, that's recruitment. There are, of course, a couple of other negative factors as well that may have impacted why these practices are up for sale. The first is that the NHS pay increments are not matching the increases in costs. So there is generally a downward pressure on those practices and their profitability. And for some practices which were on the borderline, it had maybe pushed them over the edge and into loss making. And the third thing is that there were just maybe some bad acquisitions at the time. What's important to remember about the venture capitalist model is you're buying a practice at say 6 or 7 times EBITDA with the view that when that practice is in group, even after head office arbitrage, is that you can then ultimately sell on that practice as part of the group for a much bigger multiple. Now, some of the multiples for the groups that are believed in the press, that multiple can be up to 14 to 17 times. So when you're coming towards the end of your VC life your VC cycle, so i.e. you're looking at exit in the next 6 to 9 months, there is a temptation to go and acquire easy EBITDA that fits easily on the profit and loss sheet, to easily can then be flipped for maybe sort of 3-4 times the money that you first purchased it for. And of course, normally the directors and the board, they're probably going to change when the VC changes and when the exit happens. So they have no incentive to really make sure that those acquisitions are safeguarded. So it's probably fair to say that within a number of the groups, there were some acquisitions that were made in light of a very prominent exit, but maybe wouldn't have been acquisitions that would have been made at the earliest, an earlier point in the cycle. Okay, that's the negative. Now I'm going to talk to you about some positive. The first thing is that the fact there are some new consolidators and group acquirers who appear regularly. Probably once a month we get approached by a new group acquirer or new consolidator who is actually very, very serious about buying dental practices and goes on to do so. Don't get me wrong, we get approaches all the time, but a lot of these people, haven't got the money behind them, or they're not in the right place to make acquisitions. But on average, about once a month, so about 12 a year, new people come to the service and they do go on to buy 2, 3, 10, 20 dental practices. Someone we're doing a lot of work with at the moment is someone who wasn't even in the sector 2 years ago. And these people are buying not just NHS practices, but they're now increasingly also buying private practices. So that place, if you like, whereas private dental or bigger private acquisitions was all about 2 or 3 people 3 or 4 years ago, now that marketplace is flooded with both new entrants and also maybe some entrants now who have got some great stability and are doing some great things. The other thing is funding is more accessible. So whereas before, as we came out the back end of the recession, getting a loan to buy a dental practice was maybe a little bit more challenging than it is now. And we see some fantastic challenger banks come into the sector who are lending people money on as little as a 5% deposit if there is adequate security in the background. So it's perfectly feasible now that a dentist who had, say, £200,000 in available security in his residential property is now being able to buy a dental practice with as little as £50,000 in his back pocket for a purchase price of up to £1 million. And given that our average sale value now is around £819,000, that makes the market very, very accessible to lots of people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to buy a dental practice 18 months ago. But it's important to recognise that independent buyer is savvier. There's loads of people in the marketplace, including us now, who have all got an opinion and they've all got an expert in their field. So the independent buyer is savvier, which is why it's incredibly important now that you do get the right advice to make your practice as profitable as possible when you come to sale. Because put simply, you can put your practice on the market and you can pull a figure out of the air based on gross revenue or based on turnover. But then when that practice goes through the financial due diligence cycle with both the bank, the accountant and the lender for your individual purchaser, it may well fall over because that independent buyer isn't just handing over the money, they're taking lots of advice along the way.
Okay, so let's review the different methods of valuing a dental practice. As Luke quite rightly pointed out is in his portfolio assessment, practices can be run differently depending on the ownership. And there's 2 core bases for these valuations. One is a principal-led model, which we're assuming that somebody's going to work there and earn there clinically, also known as an owner-occupier based valuation. And then what we've got is called associate-led valuations. And these are based on a straight multiple of EBITDA. So in order to illustrate this in, I suppose, the most straightforward way, I've got 2 practices that are both very similar. Both very similar in terms of turnover composition. We've got NHS income at 400,000, where they're both delivering similar private and hygiene income at 20 and 30,000, and both turning over 450,000. I suppose the crucial bit, the crucial difference between these 2 practices is that practice 2 is actually delivering 12.5% more UD activity. So that has a massive knock-on effect in terms of material, lab spend, and associate fees. In order to illustrate that the best way we can in these examples, is that the costs that we've used are based on typical averages of what a dental practice would typically spend. So if we take a look at practice 2, for instance, already you can see that the UDA rate is significantly lower than practice 1 at £22.22. The material and lab spend is obviously higher because we're having to deliver more work. And associate fees, again, has a knock-on effect. And they're having to deliver over 2,000 UDAs. And on this basis, we're looking at paying the dentist £10 a UDA. So already we're paying out another £20,000 in associate payout. Hygienist fees, nothing's changed there, but there is a slightly bigger lab recharge because we're assuming that the dentists are paying 50% of the lab bills. If we're then looking at the other costs, rent doesn't really change. However, there are some differences in terms of establishment costs. You would expect an increase in clinical waste. You'd expect an increase in various other costs, such as light and heat and repairs and renewals. And also, on this basis, assuming that there's another 2,000 UDAs to be delivered, we're also taking the view that we're going to need another part-time nurse in order to deliver that as well and to work alongside the dentist. So what does that mean? So if you look at practice 2, again, both practices very similar turnover composition. One is returning almost an 8% lower return than practice 1. And that's the core difference here when you're looking at the valuations. Practice 1 offers a much stronger acquisition for somebody perhaps who's a more corporate or group investor, so somebody who potentially could look to buy the practice and operate on an associate-led basis. However, practice 2 probably doesn't offer that level of return, and also there's less margin in it when you consider that the UDA rate, for instance, is probably lower than what the national average is. So if you're looking at this as an acquirer, you're likely to get a stronger valuation for practice 2 based on an owner-occupier-led model than what you are in practice 1, which is probably better, stronger investment for somebody who's looking to acquire on an associate-led basis. So how important is it to make sure that you maintain that income, and what effect does that have on your profit? Let's take practice 1 as an illustration of this. Let's assume in this case that you've got private income that's dropped by 10,000. You've got hygiene income that equally has dropped by 10,000, which means that we've got a turnover now of 430,000. We're still having to deliver the same UDAs, so we're just assuming here that there's just been a drop in private gross. From a gross profit point of view, obviously your materials and lab fees will change. Your associate fees, you'll be paying out less as you're delivering less. And the same obviously for your mats and labs, you're delivering less and therefore you'll be paying out less. And again, your lab recharge will have a knock-on effect on that. From a hygienist point of view, as you can see in this case, even though now we're delivering £10,000 less income, the hygienist is still paid the same. And this is because different practices have different models of running a hygiene book. In this case, we're assuming that they're paid an hourly rate. Therefore, if this income dropped to 5,000, we'd still be in the exact same position. We're still paying out £12,000 in hygienist fees. However, if we were paying on a percentage basis, this would have a much stronger effect or an impact or a positive impact on the payout ratio of what you'd be paying out to the hygienist. And again, this is quite a pertinent point that when you are recruiting in the future, is looking at how you can make sure that your cost base is almost reflective of what you're paying out when you're looking at your gross income versus payout ratio. The other negative side of or impact in this is that unfortunately your other fixed costs don't change. So your rent stays the same, establishment costs stay the same, and again staff costs stay the same. So just because you're delivering £10,000 less in income doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need the same amount of staff. The nurses are still contract, they're still there to work. It doesn't mean they go home early just because somebody's delivered £10,000 less than what they were delivering the previous year. So again, this is quite an important part to understand as part of this process. So the effect on EBITDA is the return has dropped, and we've got £13,240 less. On the negative side, it means that the drop in income at a 7 times multiple is what typical practices are going for this type of practice, depending on the location. You're looking at a £92,860 drop in terminal value. So it's quite a big difference. Equally, on the positive side of that, a £20,000 increase can equally have the exact opposite effect, and it can increase your valuation. So it's incredibly important to make sure that actually any increase in revenue has a larger impact on your terminal value as much as it can if you're losing revenue, as in terms of a negative point of view.
Right, so you're nearly halfway through. So what we thought we'd do for the second half of this webinar is to give you some sort of takeaways that you can take away from this, rather than focus on the numbers that you can put into practice to both improve the value of your dental practice, but also maybe help you along your way with your practice sale journey and make it that bit much easier.
Number one is keep one eye on the market. There are many publications out there that can give you a good indication of what the market's doing. We have a goodwill survey that we release biannually, which gives you a good indication in terms of what the market's doing, what valuations are doing. Also gives you a look at benchmarking costs, and you can look at how you compare to the market. There's the NASDAQ goodwill survey, which equally you can look at. And also it's about understanding what your valuation is and making sure you're planning for that for the future. An annual valuation checkup can give you a good indication as to what the market's doing. The market's constantly changing. What your practice was worth 6 months ago isn't necessarily going to be worth the same in 6 months' time, particularly where you've got new consolidators coming into the market. So it's important to always keep your eye on the market and the finger on the pulse.
And as Paul said earlier, just little changes in income can actually make massive differences in terms of valuation, and be that positive or be it negative. So the important factor is to really focus on your exit year. You want your exit year to be the strongest year you can have in the ownership and the running of your dental practice, both from an income perspective, from a cost perspective, and also from a just general plain sailing perspective. And because that's what you're going to be protracting to your business, is that yes, buyers are going to want to look at 3 years worth of accounts, but the focus is really on that last year. But of course there needs to be, you can't have big jumps all over the place, so you need to think about that really over 3 years, but the final year is the most important one. So in the first instance, you want to grow your income. As Paul presented to you, a £20,000 growth in income can really push up the value of your practice by sort of nearly £100,000, and in some cases a lot more. Obviously, we used a multiple of 7, but in some of the London and really urban areas, you can see multiples as high as 8.5. So the impact can be even more. Number 2, it's all about the exit year. So the focus as you approach selling your dental practice really should be on that final year of ownership, and making sure that that final year of ownership delivers the strongest profitability, the strongest income, and also your strongest year in terms of general stability in the practice. And by that I mean staffing, associates, retention, dental plan numbers. Now some of these things are of course going to be outside your control, and there's going to be an element of Murphy's Law that when you want your exit year, something will happen. But remember just not to hit the panic button, and to try and recover, or overcome whatever obstacle or hurdle you may have in that final exit year in a sensible fashion before you approach the sale of your dental practice. Because the last thing you want to do, for instance, is have an associate leave the practice and then take 6 months to replace them, by which point you've lost 3 to 4 months worth of income in the gap you've had in between your last associate leaving and your current associate starting. As Paul mentioned to you earlier, just a £20,000 increase or decrease in income can have big swings in EBITDA, and those big swings can be worth even more than £100,000 in valuation terms. Because if we're looking at some of the really urban areas, we used a multiple of 7 in the earlier presentation, but actually some of the multiples can swing as high as 8.5 to 9 times. So you could even be looking at nearer to £150,000 change in valuation for what would be, in your view, a very minor change in the actual performance of the practice. The other point is to look at staff. Now, I get it. You want to sell your practice, your staff have been with you 20 years, maybe even longer, and you want to protect them post-sale, because with the best will in the world, your buyer will come along and they'll tell you whatever you want to hear to ensure that you sell your practice to them. So they will tell you they'll look after the staff, but you're just not 100% sure that how well they're going to look after the staff. And ultimately, when you've sold the practice, there's nothing you can do, because you've handed over the keys and you've contractually given the running of that dental practice to your purchaser. So what a lot of people make the mistake of doing is saying, well, I'm going to protect my staff by giving them pay rises in advance of sale, because of course your new purchaser has to take on those pay rises under the 2P regulations. For those of you that don't know, 2P stands for the Transfer of Undertaking of Permanent Employees, or if they're a limited company, you don't have 2P, but because the employer does not change, the contractual terms of your staff remain the same. So if you give your staff a pay rise, what you do is you ensure that your future purchaser has to continue to pay them that amount, but that may have a heavy impact on EBITDA. So for instance, if you put your staff costs up by £10,000, which is very easily done if you award, say, a 4 or 5% increase, then you may have lost at a 7 multiple £70,000 in valuation terms. Now, would you really want to cost yourself £70,000?
Okay, and number 3 is planning your exit. As Luke quite rightly pointed out, the year before sale is incredibly important to make sure you're maximising what you get for the practice. However, planning 3 to 5 years in advance, depending on the type of practice you have, can offer huge benefits. Particularly if you're a high private grossing dentist. Typically on those sort of structures, you would typically have a level of deferred consideration, and it's worth considering actually if you're at the point now where you're ready to sell, is whether you want to take that risk in terms of terminal value. And what I mean by that is if somebody was to come in and buy your practice now for, let's say, £1 million, they may only be prepared to offer you 80% on completion, with the remainder split over 2 or 3 years, which means that the burden on the risk is back on you to achieve your private gross in order to make sure that you're achieving your payout. So it's important to plan ahead as to whether as to what your long-term ambitions are. I worked with vendors in the past, for instance, where they were high-grossing private dentists at one point, and over a 3 or 4 year period, took themselves out of the business, which equally took out a lot of the risk in that respect. And equally put them in a stronger position when it came to putting the practice out to the market, which meant that even though, yes, there was probably a lower level of deferred payment, the risk wasn't necessarily attached all to them. And that's quite a crucial point when you're looking to plan your exit. And it's important to understand what you want to get out your exit as well and the likely purchaser.
Recruit and retain a good team. So we've kind of touched on recruitment throughout this presentation, but actually that's because it's become an increasingly more pertinent issue. And one thing that your purchaser is going to be particularly worried about is the retention of your team post-sale, particularly your associates, but also potentially more importantly, also your management team. So a lot of practices now are running with a really good practice manager, as the burdens of running a practice have increased in the most recent years, what with information governance and CQC. So you want to make sure that these people are going to stay with the business post-completion. And the way to do that is to make sure that they want to stay with the business. It sounds very stupid, but actually is that looking after your associates and looking after your team so that they're engaged in the business will get you a considerable way forward when it comes to selling the practice. For instance, we're working with a practice at the moment, and in the past year, they have had, we worked it out to be a 304% churn on their ancillary staff. So they employ a team of about 17 people. And of those 17 people, only 3 people are the same 3 people that were there a year ago. Now, we're struggling to sell that business because a lot of people are worried about the idea that actually, why is this business churning so much staff? Is it the fact that there's too much pressure on the staff? So therefore, we need more staff, which then comes at a cost. Cost, EBITDA, lower valuation. Is it the fact that it's an area that's hard to recruit for? Okay, hard to recruit. Empty chairs, lower income, lower valuation. Is it a case that actually the practice or the principal is a nightmare to work for? And if the principal's staying on, as Paul just said, why would you want to work with them? Why do you want to buy a problem? And I suppose that's the key message here: is people don't want to buy problems. At the very outset of this presentation, we spoke about how what some of the groups are going through at the moment is getting rid of their problems. So they're now being a bit smarter about where they acquire. And that's indeed started to see that some goodwill values have dipped in certain areas of the country because they don't want to buy problems. And so particularly if you're outside and in the more rural areas, this issue number 4 about recruiting and retaining a good team is even more important, because actually the bigger risk I see is the cost of a replacement. I mentioned golden handshakes, sort of £20,000, £25,000, just to find an associate to work in the edges of Cornwall and Devon. So bearing in mind that there are these temptations out there in the marketplace for these people, think about how you can lock them in, because what a lot of people will do in evaluation anyway is they will say, well, okay, well, it's great that this person is on £10 a UDA now, but actually if I had to replace them, I'm probably going to have to budget that role at £11 or £12 a UDA anyway. So take some decent advice from a decent valuer who is doing lots of dental practice. And that doesn't need to be us. There are a number of our competitors out there as well. But as to what the market rate is in a given area. And as you approach selling, it may well be worth evaluating whether actually to keep the associates on side, you do look at whether it makes sense to move them nearer to a market rate value. I mean, I know Paul's acted on a transaction recently where all of the associates were paid, I think, around $10.30 UDA. And that was one of the challenges.
Consideration versus remuneration. And this again ties quite nicely into exit planning. It's important to consider whether it's more important to take more consideration up front in terms of terminal value, where you will pay less tax, which at the moment, pre-budget, is if you're on entrepreneur's relief, is 10%. Whereas actually, if you're continuing on as an associate, as a higher rate taxpayer, then obviously long term you're paying more tax than what you would be if you take the tax hit now or post budget. Why is that important? Well, as we've discussed through the presentation, valuations are calculated based on a multiple of EBITDA. Ultimately, if they're having to pay you more and their payout ratio is higher, then they're offering you lower consideration up front. So even though you may think that you can get the same consideration up front and be paid £12, £13 a UDA, in some instances, depending on the type of practice, you may be able to negotiate a very good deal. However, when you're looking at multiples and what practices are typically selling for, you want to make sure that you're maximising as much as you can get in terms of terminal value, particularly if you're going to be continuing and staying on as an associate post-completion.
And I suppose the important aspect of that is to ensure that the deal works for you overall, because there's nothing to say that the deal you're offered at the point of completion is the deal you'll still have in 3 years' time. Is that once you've sold the practice, you've lost control of the practice. So your purchaser could offer you the world at the point of completion, but then there's nothing to stop you unless you put it explicitly within the sale contract. There's nothing to stop them turning around after 6 months and saying, I can't afford to pay you £14 a UDA or £13 a UDA, therefore I'm going to put you down to what the rest of the associates are in. So there's an age-old phrase about having a bird in the hand, and in this case we would always recommend that, because actually once you've sold the business, unless you have adequate protection in the SPA, which is almost going to be impossible to do for the period of 7 to 8 years, which is reflective of the typical multiple at the moment, it just makes sense to have the money in your hand. Sort your associates out before you do anything. Now, we have a list of horror stories here about sort of 10 miles long, slight exaggeration maybe. But before people sell the practice, the biggest asset that they have is the people that work for them. And the people that work for them are often the associates, who are more often than not, and pretty much exclusively in dentistry, self-employed associates. Now, what that means is the fact that within their self-employed agreements, they can go and work wherever they wish to, unless you stop them from doing so. So in a typical associate contract, you will have what's known as binding out clauses or restrictive covenants, depending how you want to refer to them. And these clauses will prevent your associate from working within a given mile radius and from working and poaching your patients or directly marketing your patients to follow them to, say, a neighbouring village or a neighbouring town. But there's a little bit of a misconception in terms of how restrictive covenants work, because EU law prevents you from putting a restrictive covenant in a contract which stops someone from earning a living. So people believe, and sometimes people have doctored templates from the BDA or from Code or whoever you've got your associate agreement from, they've doctored them to what they think will be more favourable for them. So whereas, I say, a typical associate agreement may have a binding out clause of, say, 2, 3 or 4 or 5 miles, is I've seen principals change that to be 10 or 20 miles with the view that then they're fully protected. But actually that doesn't work, because if that was tested by a court, the chances are that that particular agreement would be thrown out. And there's no litmus test. People believe that, oh, if the judge says that 10 miles is too wild, he'll cross it out and say 5 miles is fine. The agreement is either 10 miles or it's nothing. So these people actually don't have associate contracts that have effective restrictive covenants. They effectively have no restrictive covenants because they've made them too ambiguous and too wide. So what can happen, and I've had this happen on a number of occasions where people haven't done this, is you go to your associate and they get wind you're looking to sell the practice, and sometimes that's because you tell them. We have lots of principals we work with who determine that their favoured purchaser is their associate. So they come to us, they get a valuation, they get a price, and then they go to the associate and say, look, I'm considering selling the business. I've had a valuation, and the valuation is, for argument's sake, £1 million. I'm prepared to sell it to you at, say, £950,000. Do you want to make me an offer? And I've had it with a particular lady I worked with in central England, where the associate turned around and said, yeah, I want to buy the business, but I'm only prepared to offer you £600,000 because actually my goodwill is my goodwill. So that's my patient, that's mine really, that's not yours. So we'll take my goodwill out of it and I'll offer you £600,000. Now, quite rightly, the principal turned around and said, well, I've had it valued at £1 million. Why would I accept a 40% reduction? But because he didn't have an effective restrictive covenant in his contract, what this particular associate then did is, because they had disagreement on price, he served 3 months' notice, and then he opened up a practice a little more than 2 miles away. And he took all of his patients with him and then also started actively marketing to the same patients from the same practice. So what this lady was left with was a revenue that was decimated by the loss of someone who was generating 40% of the income in her business, and a business where the turnover was declining so much, there was no interest in it because it was such an unstable ship. Furthermore, is that when we took the business back to market some 2 years later, the value was nowhere near £1 million, because in that 2-year period, she hadn't been able to recover the income that she'd lost from that associate. Now, that could have been so easily prevented, by actually having restricted covenants in place in the associates contracts before even opening that discussion. And that really is important. Associates are commonly purchasers of dental practices, and commonly there is a disagreement about price. And we have a way in which we advise you approach that, which I'm more than happy to discuss with you. But actually, that can only be achieved in the event that you do have associate agreements. The other things to check is that one period in time, some of the templates that would be given out by the British Dental Association did have errors in them, which did mean that the associate agreements weren't effective when they were tested. So one thing I would advise you do, and we'll come on to specialist advisors in a little while, is that you make sure that those associate contracts are checked in the first instance by your specialist advisors, because this could be a truly fatal mistake if you get it wrong.
So point number 7. The bank might have the final say, and this is quite an important point when you're looking to choose a buyer. If you've got a practice particularly that's quite popular on the market, and you've got a number of offers, it's making sure that making sure that those buyers are screened in terms of their affordability, and making sure that they've got the necessary access to cash or equity in the event that the bank turn around and say that the valuation doesn't meet what they were prepared to lend against. And this is fairly common. Ultimately, the banks have their own independent valuers that they'll send out to agree that they're happy to lend based on, let's say, a valuation of £1 million. However, the bank will only offer a set amount of contribution against what they're prepared to lend against. So if the bank turn around and say, actually, this business is now worth £800,000, therefore, what they will need from the buyer is a goodwill premium. So they're not prepared to lend against that other £200,000, which means that the buyer has to find access to cash or equity in order to make sure that they can actually buy the practice. And this is quite an important point, particularly where you've got a practice in a very popular location, if obviously all agents work differently, where we have an open bidding process which allows buyers to competitively bid against one another. And it's important that if a practice is going above and beyond what a practice is marketed at, that the buyer can actually afford to bridge that gap in the event that the bank turn around and say they're not happy to lend against what they believe the valuation is worth, or the way they believe the practice is worth against what the independent valuation that they've got.
Okay, I get it. You've worked with them for 20 years, you've worked with them for 25 years. Joan is your best friend, you go out for dinner with her on a Friday night. So you feel that you're being a total charlatan by having this secret clandestine conversations with your broker and your buyer and your accountant and your solicitor in the run-up to the sale of the dental practice. So you think, I'm going to tell Joan my intentions, I'm selling the practice. The only problem is that Joan then tells everyone else. So now you come into work on a Tuesday morning and Joan accidentally let it slip that actually you're selling the practice. And all of a sudden you've got 12 staff who all know that you're selling the dental practice. And you imagine if you were in their shoes, okay, their immediate thought is change. And what do people hate? Change. So what they do is they start looking at other opportunities, they start looking for other jobs. All of a sudden you've got a couple of resignations on your hand. You've got the associates kicking off because they wanted to buy the practice and you didn't give them the opportunity, or you're asking too much money and they can't finance it, so then they go as well. And your value of £1 million is slowly dripping away just because you've told the staff. And also, it gives them the uncertainty. I'll be perfectly frank with you. We work with many vendors over the years and we try and make the journey as comfortable as possible. But most of them would explain the journey as being somewhat discomfortable. But by sharing the burden of the sale, you're making your staff uncomfortable. You're making them feel nervous about what's going to happen post-sale. So just don't tell them. It makes life a lot easier, and it means that your goodwill is protected without them worrying every day about what the future might hold.
Lie to the CQC. And what I mean by this is in certain instances where the CQC is an important part of that sales process. For instance, if you've got a private practice, it's probably not as important. But if you've got an NHS contract that you're needed to transfer as part of that process, is you now need confirmation from the CQC that they're happy for that partnership to exist in order for you to issue notices to the local area team in order for you to successfully transfer that NHS contract. Previously, or not to probably the last 2 or 3 months, but prior to that, the CQC would allow those partnerships without any necessarily questions asked. Yeah, fair enough, you go through the normal processes. However, they had a protocol and a process which allowed you to go into partnership. However, recently they've issued some new guidance, which they are concerned about the level of applications that are going in for the purposes of what they call a bridging partnership. And what they mean by that is it's just for the process of selling the practice and for the vehicle of allowing you to put one partner on and and allowing you to transfer the practice as a result of that. Some of you may know that the CQC is quite an important part of the process for allowing you to transfer an NHS contract. And the CQC more recently has issued guidance or dated guidance that the bridging partnership, which currently allows us to put that NHS contract into the new partner's name, is their questioning. And it's very important that we are working along the same lines, that the actual CQC partnership is in effect a real partnership. Although it is fictitious for the point of actually transferring the contract, in the point of the CQC's eyes, it is an actual partnership. And it's important to remember that. And more recently, when there are a number of objections, and obviously they're coming back with a number of questions to try and identify whether this partnership is a real partnership or not. And it's very important that through this process, and through that CQC process, is that we are labouring the point that it is an effective partnership for the purposes of going into partnership, not for sale.
Think about your property situation. Okay, so you've been in your dental practice for years, and you have a leasehold practice. Now, when you come to buy a practice, the minimum lease you're going to need is somewhere in the region of, say, 10 to 15 years. Now, if your seller hasn't got 10 or 15 years, then it becomes a real challenge for the bank to lend you the money. So let's say you take a scenario where the seller has 8 years. What that means from the bank perspective, for most cases, is that the loan that would have been done over a 10-year repayment period has to be squeezed into 8 years. Now, we spoke earlier, Paul mentioned debt serviceability. That's really going to put pressure on the debt serviceability, because it may mean that actually the loan becomes unaffordable, and thus accordingly the purchase just won't work for a number of purchases you want to buy your practice. And that's of course coupled with the fact that with only 8 years left on the lease, purchasers may take a different view as to what they're prepared to pay you for the practice anyway. So if you can get an extension to your lease to a minimum of a 10-year term at the point of completion, then that's something that we would really advise you to do before you go to market. And of course there is this challenge between managing your landlord, because your landlord could be very commercial, and if they get wind about why you want an extension on the lease, if you're not actually due to renegotiate terms yet, so say you do have 8 years left, they may say, well, yeah, fine, we'll give you an extension to your lease, we'll take it out to 15 years in exchange for a lease premium. So you pay us £200,000, we'll give you 15 years. And put simply, if you want the artificial £1 million practice we've been talking about, you have absolutely no other option but to hand over the £200,000, because technically your landlord doesn't have to talk to you for another 7.5 years. So you either sit tight or you cough up the money. Whereas if you can manage your landlord appropriately, then actually there's no reason to put yourself in this situation. Now, I understand that for some people coming towards the end of their lease, you maybe want to consider, if your landlord isn't very commercial, potentially balancing that argument between just getting them to grant a new lease straight to your purchaser, because then that will mean that purchaser then is fully on the hook for the lease term, and you don't have to give what's known as an AGA, meaning you're on the hook for the remainder of the lease term if they don't pay the rent. Of course, dental practices are generally pretty safe tenants, so it's not a big risk, but it's one to weigh up. But certainly think about the options.
Preparing for the due diligence process. As part of selling a practice, there are 1,000,001 things that the buyer wants to know about you and about your practice and about who works for you. And it's important to make sure that you've got a lot of this documentation pre-prepared. The solicitor would provide you with a documentation as and when you go through that process and you found a buyer, and that can be 60 to 80 pages long. And there's actually quite a lot of that you can prepare beforehand, whether that be a Legionnaire's disease certificate, whether it be a fire risk assessment. There's various bits and pieces which you can do to make sure that even before you go to sale, or before you go to market, should I say, that you've got a number of these things prepared. And there's also a checklist out there that can make sure that you can put your ducks in a row well before that you go to market. Ultimately, there are going to be questions in that due diligence that you're not going to know, that you're not necessarily going to know until you're going more in terms of the in-depth process of it. However, there are things that you can do to make you prepare for it prior to sale.
And the final one, understand your business structure and its implications. Okay, now this really focuses on the idea of whether you're selling a limited company, which we refer to internally as a share sale, or whether you practice currently as a sole trader or an expense sharing partnership, and when you're referred to internally as what we call an asset sale, the actual implications in terms of the sale mechanism are very, very different. Okay, let's talk about share sales to begin with, because potentially these are the more complicated ones, or the ones where there's potentially more room for error. The first is to understand the fact that when you sell the business in a share sale, you're selling absolutely everything. You're selling all of the assets and also all of the liabilities. So put simply, if you have an electricity bill that you haven't paid from 3 years ago, in a share sale, your purchaser takes on that liability for that electricity bill. In an asset sale, they don't. So when it comes to due diligence, when you come to do a share sale, understandably the due diligence process is a lot heavier, because it's really important to understand the history of the business and what that might mean. Now, there are of course a number of what we call bodged corporations down out there, because there's some brilliant accountants, but there's equally some terrible ones. So what we often see is we see limited companies where actually all that is it's a shell. It's where all of the income's been funneled in and the goodwill's been moved for tax mechanism, but the lease is still in the personal names, the employment contracts are still in the personal names, the bills are still in personal names, or there's a haphazard fashion to some are and some aren't. The problem becomes is the fact that then when you go to sell the business, your purchase expectation is that you will have a clean unit where everything is in the limited company name. And particularly if your NHS contract isn't in the limited company name, they will argue that they don't want to buy the limited company at all, because actually, and then there is a superannuation risk as to whether actually your associates and yourself were even entitled to the pension contributions associated with the same. So when it comes to selling the business, you want to make sure you are as clean as a whistle. You want to get everything into that limited company, because the last thing you will probably want to do, bear in mind this is a pre-recorded webinar and this could all change next week, is the last thing you want to do is do an asset sale when you have got a limited company with loads of goodwill, because that will be incredibly punitive from a tax perspective. So make sure you sort that out. The other side of things is that when you go to sell a business, and in a share sale context, is that you also sell all of the assets and the tangible assets, and then what I'm referring to here is cash. So if you have lots of cash in the limited company, let's say £200,000, you are going to sell your purchaser that £200,000, and they will pay you, theoretically on paper, £200,000 more for that limited company, for the value of your business. Now the upside for that for you is that as it stands at this point in time, is that £200,000 will be taxed at entrepreneurs relief at the 10% rate, whereas actually if you'd extracted that £200,000 from the limited company pre-completion, then you could be paying that at your highest rate of income tax, whatever that may be at the given time. So it's a real seller's advantage, and actually the difference to a purchaser is largely irrelevant, because actually the difference is only probably 0.5% on stamp duty if you get the right accounting advice. But lots of people don't understand this and don't understand this mechanism, and it frightens a lot of people. So when you go to market, you want to make sure you really do understand it, because it is a question that will come up quite a lot as you come to sell the business, and it may indeed, as you say, lose interest in the business if your purchaser doesn't get the right advice at the right time. And those are our takeaway points. So thank you for listening to all of this webinar and watching myself and Paul go through every point that we think is particularly relevant to dental practices. Of course, this webinar has been limited to an hour, so there are thousands of other topics that could affect the value of your business, or that you could potentially use to improve the value in your business in the run-up to sale. For that reason, we offer something which we call the Practice Health Check. Now, the Practice Health Check is both free of charge and commitment, and we're quite happy to do it of an evening or early morning before the surgery opens. So we'll come out to the practice, we'll give you an idea as to what the value of your business is now, and how that value could potentially be improved. If you are interested in one, please do give us a call. Thank you.